I'm sorry. The resuming debate, and the honourable member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my fellow colleague and rookie MP from Cypress Hills Grasslands for his amazing intervention. On his first day in office, U.S. President Joe Biden cancelled the expansion of the Keystone XL pipeline, a project that is critical to Canada's economic interests and pushed 1,000 people into unemployment immediately. The Prime Minister responded by waving a white flag. The Prime Minister got so tough that he declared how much he was looking forward to working with the new president on their mutual goals. The government has told Canadians that the president is keeping a campaign promise and that we ought to move on. It's easy to say if you're a Prime Minister who has recently shut down Parliament and spent most of his time at his home in his cottage while hardworking Canadians went to work and others are being put out of their jobs. What the Prime Minister is really telling hardworking Canadians in the oil and gas sector and the industries that support it is that you ought to move on from the much-needed jobs that support your livelihoods, that you ought to move on from making sure that you can put food on the table and provide for yourself and your children, that Albertans should move on from an industry that gets us to work, that keeps our houses warm when it's -20 outside, that supplies all of the plastics in the PPE that has been so valuable during this pandemic. Mr. Speaker, here are the facts. Canadians are being asked to move on from 1,000 direct construction jobs, an anticipated 2,800 directly related projects that are jobs that could be available in Alberta, $1 billion equity investment in Keystone XL by Natural Law Energy, which represents 5 First Nations in Alberta and Saskatchewan, $1.1 billion of Government of Alberta investment, manufacturing jobs in Ontario and elsewhere that support oil and gas development, and not to mention all of the potential jobs of internships for newly graduated students who, when I've been doing my recent Zoom meetings with a lot of students these days, this is what they're worried about, that there are no more jobs and no more internships. And this is a direct attack to those students. Must I remind the Prime Minister that Canada is in the middle of the greatest public health crisis and economic shock that this country has seen in many decades? The government squandered an opportunity to bolster economic development during a time that Canadians most desperately need it, and instead is looking for the Great Reset, none of which is appealing to Albertans nor most Canadians. Many businesses in Alberta and throughout the country have closed because of the pandemic. The vacancies of office space in downtown Calgary are staggering. Families are struggling to scrape by, and people's mental health has been greatly affected. Through the Keystone XL expansion, we had an opportunity to encourage significant job growth and investment. But this Prime Minister has abandoned Canadians. While the Prime Minister is more than willing to turn his back on hardworking Canadians and an industry that much of the world envies, Conservatives will always put Canadians first. Canadians are tired of a Liberal government that continues to pander to the radicals while shaming our own oil and gas sector in the process. Mr. Speaker, the Canadian oil and gas industry is a product of inspiring ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit. It is an industry that we have every right to be proud of, which is why I found the Prime Minister's response to the President's decision puzzling and weak. We have heard about how the Prime Minister called the President and expressed disappointment. Disappointment is an understatement. Was that really all the Prime Minister could say? Why haven't we heard more from the Prime Minister and his government about how great Canadians are at producing our own resources? Our people and companies are incredible innovators. I recently visited a company that has developed a system that monitors pipelines in real time and transmits information about an event instantly. This shows the innovation that we're seeing in this industry. While oil production has gone up, our emissions intensity has decreased in a very significant way. And to a growing world that needs reliable energy, that's an important fact. Since 2000, Canada's oil sands intensity is down by 20%. Emission levels from new projects are near or better than the average level of emissions from American crude. Sadly, this government seems very reluctant to cheer on the accomplishments of Canadians. All across the country, work continues on the economic development and environmental protection. Yet all they hear from this leader are platitudes about balancing economy and environment while he kills their jobs. Canadian workers are ahead of this government. They care about the environment, and they also care about their jobs. From a U.S. perspective, why would President Biden say yes to Keystone XL? From his view, in Washington, he has likely watched as Prime Minister Trudeau killed Northern Gateway and Energy East. I have no doubt his response to the Prime Minister was, if you don't want your own oil, why would we want it?
Order. I just, again, bring to the honourable member, I know we're getting back into our habits of being in the House again, and the honourable member didn't want to interrupt him, but it's a good time to make note. The honourable member, by all means, the honourable member, go ahead.
Thank you. Unfortunately, this would seem to be a final chapter of the long saga that is Keystone XL pipeline. The Obama government punted the project around like a political football for years and years. That president's own State Department had approved it twice. But Mr. Obama waited until the Liberal government was sworn in and then rejected the application, with very little objection from this Prime Minister than anyone else. It becomes too clear to so many of us that this Prime Minister and his government are looking to cover up their real agenda, the destruction of the Canadian resource economy. Nothing of the last 5 years of this government has Albertans convinced that the Liberals have our economics' best interests at heart. They vetoed the Northern Gateway pipeline. Energy East shot down by ever-changing and burdensome regulations. They have stood idly by while Keystone XL was vetoed twice. Anti-energy legislation like Bill C-48 to ban exports off the Northwest Coast and C-69 that altered the regulatory process to such a degree that it got labeled the No More Pipelines Act. The government botched the Trans Mountain expansion to such a degree that they nationalized it. Numerous other taxes and delays are just more pile-up to this government's failed policies. And unfortunately, other parties represented in this House have cheered on every delay and veto, no matter how much it hurts their fellow Canadians. This is having a very negative effect on our Confederation. Albertans are not willing to move on. That's why it hasn't been a surprise to Westerners that all the Prime Minister could muster up was an expression of disappointment over the phone and not much else. With the government's track record, the cancellation of a crucial pipeline seems par for the course. But let me remind the Prime Minister that first and foremost, he is Canada's Prime Minister. He has a responsibility to stand up for Canadian workers and their families. We call on the Prime Minister to show that he hasn't turned his back on Canadians and assertively re-engage the President to make sure the Keystone XL expansion resumes. I've heard many times from my constituents, many who are either close to retirement or about 10 years to retirement. These are hard-working Canadians who are men and women that drive the rigs on the oil fields. And where else do they have to go? If we're killing this industry, we're killing their livelihood, and we're killing them. The amount of times I've heard over and over again that mental health issues are on the rise, suicides are on the rise. If we are not helping stand up for the industry that is providing livelihood and providing for these families, then we're contributing to those mental health issues and the rise in suicides. I hope this Prime Minister grows some fortitude, stands up for the industry, stands up for Western Canada for once, and stops all of the pandering, and let's get people to work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Looks like we're going to go back to the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very, very honored to be able to participate again and ask a very clear and direct question. We are still hearing that somehow Canada's production of oil and gas is somehow green or environmental. It's not. It contributes more greenhouse gases than almost any other form of oil, except for heavy crude, which we also know is produced elsewhere in the world. But we can, in Canada, since we produce more oil than we use, we are exporting product. If we want to continue to use Canadian oil while we transition quite rapidly off of fossil fuels, we can do that and give ourselves a timeline so that oil workers and others in the industry have time to transfer their excellent skills to renewable sector, to clean tech and green tech. So the fallacy here that somehow if we don't sell other people our oil, they'll get oil from worse places. The world is transiting off of fossil fuels, and we have to do our part. And pipelines aren't part of that moral obligation to do our part. Does the honourable member agree that we should be beginning to transfer our to diversify our economy and move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible?
Member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you to my honourable colleague for the question. Yahoo! That's what this member's tweet was when the cancellation happened. Yahoo! She was cheering on the fact that people are being put out of work, that Canadians instantly are being put out of work. Their families are being devastated by this. And this member, embarrassingly, was cheering it on by saying Yahoo! This isn't the Calgary Stampede. Yahoo is supposed to be a good term for us. But this member celebrated the contribution of our students who are looking for good paying jobs, internships, a livelihood, a future. And she was cheering on the fact that what's happening is going to contribute to mental health issues and suicides, frankly. And she said Yahoo! To that. I'm very embarrassed by that.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Souris Moose Mountain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize for taking so long. I wasn't expecting to get on this time. I want to thank the member for Calgary Forest Lawn for his speech and his comments, and he talked about a number of things that are quite important, in particular about jobs and the issue of jobs. And that's what a lot of I hear from my constituents throughout is these jobs. And here we have a prime minister continually who downplays the oil and gas industry, doesn't look to support it, but says he's got their backs. But he continues to talk about jobs. We heard from the member from Saanich Gulf Islands who basically said, well, their jobs, they'll be able to get their jobs. But a lot of these jobs where pipelines are and the oil filters is in rural Canada, not urban Canada, not big city Toronto or big city Calgary or Vancouver, where they are. This is rural Canada. And if you don't have rural Canada, you don't have urban Canada. So my question to the member is just along the lines of what sort of things does he see that can help for these jobs? We see the benefit of the carbon capture, that we see that it enhances Whitecap resources in minimizing and reducing their emissions such that they're at net zero or net negative. These are beneficial jobs. What other jobs could he suggest that the government needs to step forward on?
For Calgary Forest Lawn.
Thank you to my honourable colleague for the question. Mr. Speaker, you know, when it comes to jobs, I heard a lot in today's debate, especially from the NDP, about the government needs to create these jobs. And I don't fully agree to that. I know in a perfect socialist world where they like to dwell in, that they want the government to control everything. We want to see less government regulation. We want government to get out of the way so that jobs are created by job creators. We need to unleash them and their potential rather than putting burden on them with regulations such as Bill C-69, C-48, and the doubling up on carbon taxes. which are instant job killers, and we've seen that over and over again. What we as conservatives want to see is that people carry on that entrepreneurial spirit. I came here with my family as an immigrant, and we had something called the Alberta Advantage when we moved here. And that helped enable me and my family to be able to grow, and for me to be blessed to be in this house today. And I was a very successful and with fully, I can say with God's grace, a small business owner, because we had less burden and less regulations. And today, I deal with many immigrants, and they don't feel that Alberta Advantage is there, and neither do I, and neither do any Albertans anymore. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, and the Honourable